I'm Pei, Director of Strategic Initiatives here at ConsenSys. I am honored to introduce Josh Williams, the CEO of Forte, as our guest speaker today. Josh has been a lifelong builder and entrepreneur in games, fintech, and distributing computing. So at Forte, Josh and his team are building a transformative blockchain gaming platform that introduces breakthrough community economics to align the interests of developers and players, and by doing so, creating new opportunities for billions of players around the world. Welcome, Josh.
Hi, Pei. Thanks for having us here.
So Josh, to start off, can you tell us a little bit about what Forte is trying to do from a big picture perspective?
Yeah, big picture, we're trying to do two things really. Two sides of the same coin at the end of the day. The first is we want to bring hundreds of millions or hopefully billions of people to blockchain through gaming. Couple billion people a day play games around the world. We think gaming is just a really great adoption vector for blockchain and to accelerate its growth. We think blockchain is a big part of the future, and the game's just a great vector for it, for its adoption. And on the other end, we want to make games better. Basically, we want to create more alignment between game developers and game players, so that through blockchain and the market-based economies it can enable, players can have more agency in games and benefit from the games that they play and love already. We're really excited to be working with developers around the world to do it. We're creating an open source set of tools and technology built on top of Ethereum and other open technologies and permissionless networks to enable game developers to create new systems, new game designs in existing games and new games that are built from the ground up for blockchain. We've been at it for a while now. We're really excited to start talking about it more.
That's great that to hear accelerating the adoption of blockchain is actually part of your vision. In my opinion, gaming has been one of the most organic and natural fit for blockchain by far, and I definitely hope it will continue to help drive the user adoption through platforms like Forte. Some of the most fundamental designs in token networks came from gaming and gaming economics. So now it seems like everything are coming together with the right incentive designs and this innovative business model. So I'm really happy to hear that. But none of us, I believe, in this space can do this alone, as we heard that you've recently announced some big game studios and partners. So can you tell us what you're working on with your partners and perhaps other game developers?
Yeah, we've announced a few partners already. We're really proud of the developers we're working with at some of the leading studios around the world. There's a lot more coming online. For us, it's really encouraging to see that people in the game developers in the space, from indies to major studios and publishers, are starting to understand what's possible when they think about giving players more agency in games, creating a real market economy in their virtual worlds and games that looks more like the economy we have in the physical world that everybody can benefit from. So we're working with these developers, and it's a pretty diverse group across a bunch of different game genres, from competitive esports games to casual games on mobile and web to role-playing games and action games, strategy games. And so far the response has been really good from developers. We talk about a concept called community economics, which is really a way for everybody that participates in a game, from the players to content creators to developers themselves, to be able to benefit from a game, create a market economy in these games. It's powered by blockchain and token assets that exist on chain and are governed by commerce and smart contracts to create this trust minimized marketplace system that everybody can benefit from. Yeah, we're really happy to be working with so many leading developers around the world already, and we think there's a lot more to come.
Yeah, especially I guess in the current environment, which is this global pandemic, has really made gaming an especially hot area. So I think the silver lining around this pandemic is that it definitely served as a catalyst for reshaping business models across a lot of industries. Since today we're specifically talking about marketplaces, can you tell us how you think embracing market-driven economies or community economies, as you put it, in games would help game developers?
Yeah, for sure. I think you're totally right about both the current situation, in the world with people at home more, engaging in games more. Usage of games is up across the board really significantly, and that's great for the game industry. But there's really no way today for players to benefit from the games that they play in, or to have a stake in the games they really care about, or that they help advocate and grow. And that's part of what we're trying to change. And how that could be beneficial for developers is really, if you think about the game industry today, and just for everyone in the audience, in case they're not in the industry or don't know, the games is about $150 billion a year revenue industry today. Again, about 2 billion people around the world play games day in and day out. So it's the vast majority of people that are connected to the internet with computing devices of any form. So games are pretty ubiquitous now, pretty popular. But the industry has started to stagnate a bit. It's grown a lot over the last several years, but the game industry historically goes through these cycles that are driven by underlying technology change. And the current cycle in gaming is really dominated by a free-to-play business model, which has been great in some ways. It's moved games from retail games in the past, where people had to pay $50 or $60 up front to just access a game, to making games pretty open access. You can jump in and play for free. But the downside of the model is that a very small percentage of the player base in these games, which sometimes have tens of millions or hundreds of millions of players in an individual game, a very small percentage of those players end up paying anything at all, end up ever paying a penny. So it's great that so many people can play for free. That is really cool. And it's a big change in the industry over the last 15 years or so. But the kind of darker side of that model is that because such a small percentage of people play, game developers really are incentivized to squeeze as much money as they can out of that small percentage of players. And so what ends up happening is there's all these design challenges trying to balance people that pay, in some cases, hundreds of thousands of dollars a year in an individual game versus people that pay totally for free. How do you create, equal game experiences, or at least fair seeming game experiences between those players? There's business model challenges. It's pretty risky to rely on such a small percentage of your audience to sort of carry all your revenue into your game. You end up as a developer then catering to that very, very narrow slice of people. And in some games, again, less than 10%, often less than 5% of players ever pay anything. And then often less than 1% of a player base carries 80% of the revenue for a game. So it's a model that really sets players and developers against each other in some ways, and even players against each other in different ways, because you have big spenders versus people that don't pay anything, and how do you create balance between these? So what we're really excited about is, again, this concept of community economics, where everyone that plays a game can participate in a market economy that works very similarly to the economy in the physical world, and developers can benefit from that as well by introducing new revenue streams and a new business model, where essentially the more they can shift from thinking about how much money can I get out of my players, to instead really thinking about how can I help my players actually benefit more from my game, potentially earn income from my game. And I, as a developer, whether it's through transaction fees or token models or whatever variety of mechanics developers will come up with over time, I, as a developer, can benefit more. The bigger I make this economy, the more it benefits my players. So it's almost like the better my players do, the more income my players earn, the better I can do as a developer. And that's the model that I think is starting to excite developers, that we're working with, and others around the world.
Yeah. I wanted to add it here that this mutually beneficial market model, as you described, is now made more possible than ever before with emergent technologies such as distributed ledger technology. So coming from traditional finance background, this reminds me how the algo trading has largely replaced the human traders in traditional finance over the years, right? So automated execution and revenue sharing features that are being enabled by smart contracts could really substantially reduce the cost of running a trustless system in the gaming world and provide a way for both the players and the game developers to realize more value through that network and their honest work. So this is really can be fulfilled with very little overhead added.
Yeah, that's totally right. And that's the point you make is critical, right? Whether we're talking about a potential, market economy in a virtual world or economies in the real world, including, financial marketplaces, it's critical that marketplaces are credible, and the rules of the marketplace, can't be arbitrary in order for people to trust participating in it and feel like they want to put anything at risk or have anything at stake, or even just that they, feel confident in engaging in transactions, right? So minimizing trust is and thereby maximizing the credibility of the market, not having to rely on a sole proprietor or one centralized individual to manage an entire marketplace is critical in any large and thriving market. We think that's going to be and will be critical in these game economies we're helping developers create as well. And that's where, again, smart contracts that govern the creation of assets and the rules of the exchange of assets in a decentralized fashion becomes so important and grows the size of the potential market.
Yeah, it's a good point that you made about transparency and the trust, because at the end of the day, it seems like we're all paying financial intermediaries for maintaining this well-oiled, trustworthy market because we don't have any better alternatives. Mm-hmm. So currently we're dealing with an extremely verticalized and hierarchical system where the most amount of control and discretion sits within the centralized operator of the marketplace, and the level of transparency and security are really just regulated by the lawmakers and the government. And so hopefully what Forte is trying to accomplish here can provide a more neutral and credible market where players gain more transparency and discretion of their own assets. Exactly. So they can become the market maker themselves without relying on the game publishers. So will eventually drive participation, demand for in-game assets, and ultimately that would lead to liquidity.
That's totally right. And there's a positive feedback loop that can happen when that comes into play, where the more players know that the system works and is governed by a decentralized ledger and automated, open, transparent, and automated system that really no individual or cabal of individuals can control, the more they individually feel confident in potentially in participating in that market, and the more that they know that other players feel the same way, the more they feel like there'll be other players in the market and counterparties for transactions, and it just feels like a more equitable and fair system where they have more agency, and so it creates this positive feedback loop. And ultimately, that's what you need in any market to encourage participation and get a bigger market going.
So, do you think this is a needed change, a change that game developers should see today?
Yeah, it's a good question too. We definitely think it is. Now, not every developer, a lot of developers see this, but not every developer around the world yet. It'll take time to educate the space. But the history of games is actually, there's a long kind of repeated history of some new fundamental technology coming along, and then games figuring out how to create fun experiences around that and new business models around that technology. So you can go all the way back to the beginning of the first integrated circuits and microchips being available that drove the creation of arcade games and arcade hardware. That whole industry grew really quickly. It was one of the first major proof points and vectors of adoption for integrated circuits and microcomputers. And then that shifted to the mass market availability of microcomputers at retail prices, and that drove the creation of retail games for home personal computers and for home gaming consoles, on through the creation of the internet, which drove the digital distribution of games, subscription models in games, downloadable digital content in games, and finally, more recently, the shift to robust cloud computing capability at scale. That's really what drove games as a service, and ultimately the creation of free-to-play business models in games. So really, the whole history of the game industry is one of an underlying kind of disruptive new technology or computing technology that gets created, and then game developers figuring out really how to create fun experiences around that technology, players flock into these fun game experiences, and ultimately driving the adoption of that underlying technology. Now, is today the time for that? Again, we think it is. As I mentioned earlier, the game industry has started to stagnate a little. It's grown a lot over the last 10 or 15 years, but that growth has started to slow. More and more players around the world, to the tune of, again, millions and millions of players are, increasingly unhappy with the free-to-play model and this idea that they either have to pay a lot or play, just an absurd amount of time to get, the best assets or the best goods or the best characters in a game. And the disparity between payers and players, developers as well feel, that it's not a sustainable model really long term, or that can't be the be all and end all of the game industry. So again, when we talk to developers, including indies and big publishers in the space, they get really excited about what's possible when they think about, I could leverage blockchain to create a more participatory, economy, a community economy, a market-based system in my games that are already, popular and have a lot of users and a lot of assets that potentially could be traded and allow players to really own them.
So let's get into some of the details on what is possible with in-game market economies and the potential parallels between game marketplaces and traditional marketplaces. So we know markets start with assets, and today, as I observed, a lot of the conversation around the intersection of games and blockchain is about owning NFTs, or as we call it, non-fungible tokens. Mm-hmm. Is this how Forte is thinking about the whole thing?
Yeah, you're right. When you think about marketplaces and market economies, it starts with, what are the assets and the goods in an economy? And yeah, I think in the blockchain gaming space today, a lot of people talk about NFTs, and we think that's really just starting to scratch the surface of what's possible. NFTs are, we think about things from a couple different dimensions. One is, the types of assets. Are they fungible or non-fungible? But then equally, are they divisible or indivisible? And, today in the blockchain space, what's called an NFT is maybe in the gaming parlance, it's really just a unique asset. It's a totally unique asset that's not divisible. And in the real economy, in the physical economy, there are assets like that. You could have a jersey signed by Michael Jordan in, the final championship game that he played for the Bulls, right? And that would be a valuable asset. Collectors pay a lot for that. But and so those things exist in games, and they will continue to exist in games, and they'll be potentially high value items. But they're a pretty small percentage of the real world economy, those totally unique assets. What you have a lot of is maybe totally fungible, but also indivisible assets, like commodities, in the world, or physical goods that can't be split up, into parts infinitely. And there's analogs for those in games too. If you think about World of Warcraft, something like crafting goods like leather scraps or the gems that you slot into your gear inside of a game, those are totally fungible but indivisible items that have an atomic unit that you can't subdivide, right? And then of course you have fungible, divisible assets like currencies, and you'll also have non-fungible but divisible assets. So they could be things like a plot of land that's totally unique in a virtual world, or a guild hall that multiple players own, and that plot of land or that guild hall or the ownership in it could be subdivided into multiple pieces. And so we try to think deeply about the types of assets in virtual worlds and their analogs to assets in the real world, and then think about marketplace systems that accord with those assets. What is the best way to enable player ownership of those assets and to create a market economy around each of these different asset types? And again, there are analogs to this in the real world. If you think about, some assets, maybe the more unique assets, do really well with market mechanics that provide more discrete liquidity. So that might be things like auction-based systems, or just peer-to-peer or over-the-counter trades, which are more one-off kind of deals that you strike between players or groups of players. And again, there's analogs, of course, for that in the real world. If you think about home sales or art sales or the like, for more unique, low assets that are traded with less frequency. And then you also need more continuous systems that provide more continuous liquidity for commodities and goods that can be exchanged with more of an order book like system where there's constantly available price discovery and continuous liquidity. And so how can we introduce all these systems into the virtual worlds of games to, again, create this thriving economy for players and developers, content creators in games? And so we put a lot of time and work into creating, again, tools that developers could use to more easily adopt these systems into games and make them work at mass market scale, for players with a great user experience. And that's a really tall order to pull all that off. But, we're happy to be working with some of the best developers in the world to try to do it.
Yeah, I like the example about Mike Jordan's jersey as I've been binge watching The Last Dance recently. Right. Another example, as I can think of really quickly, is fixed income products that we buy a lot today, right? Such as mortgage-backed securities and corporate debts. The core of securitization process is really to pull various homogeneous assets into tranches and sell them with fixed terms. I can actually see that process being retrofitted and applied to in-game tokens, but this time, hopefully, with a new technology, we can track more openly and real time on the underlying assets performance and make necessary timely changes on the structure level to better manage risk.
Yep.
So I wanted to, for our audience, and by the way, for those who are online, feel free to type in any questions in the Q&A session, and we'll visit them at the end of the session and try to answer all of your questions. But Josh, for our audience, can you walk us through an overview of automated market making that you briefly mentioned? And how do you think that the automated market making can facilitate trading of assets in a game economy?
Yeah, so games have some unique challenges. In particular, an individual game can have thousands or tens of thousands of different types of assets. Again, if you think about some of the games we talked about, like World of Warcraft, or really any most popular games, there are thousands of different kinds of assets in the game. You got different types of gear. You've got crafting materials. You've got resources that you need in the game. Any popular game today has several typically virtual currencies that they'll use, and a bunch of different assets that players can collect or need in order to level up in the game or progress. And so there's in I guess mathematical financial terms, these are big combinatorial markets. It's just a ton of different asset types, and you have a long tail of assets. And so one of the key innovations is we were thinking about the different asset types that are necessary to create thriving game economies and the marketplace mechanics that really work best with those. One of the key things we worked a lot on, and the innovations we've been working on, and that we've been so happy to see in the Ethereum space in general, is the development of automated market making. Automated market making systems basically allow an algorithm to do trading for players, and so you could potentially use an automated market maker in gaming systems to always have a counterparty. It would just be a smart contract, an automated system that is willing to buy assets according to some pricing algorithm, at least at a floor price, right? It might not be the ultimate price that an item sells at, but you as a player could constantly know, you could continuously be aware of what the automated market maker is willing to purchase things at kind of at a floor price. And you have continuous and instantaneous liquidity. You could just tap a button and sell a good, whatever it is, because it's an automated market maker. It's created markets around potentially tens of thousands or millions of different types of assets. It's neutral about them all. It just uses an algorithm to price them and to provide a floor level of liquidity. You can know as a player that that's always possible. And again, that gives you more confidence about participating in the market and, potentially listing assets for sale. So we see this a lot in DeFi and Ethereum already. Uniswap's a great example of an automated market maker. People in the space have done great work on token bonding curves, which is another example of an automated market maker that fully collateralizes transactions. We've taken some of those types of ideas and innovations and tried to make them easier for developers to use, again, at mass market scale in very complex game economies that exist today and that are being created for blockchain going forward.
Yeah. So with a core community economy on the blockchain being created, and assume that the automated market making is introduced and working well, what else is possible in your view?
Yeah, so for games, like, if you think about the assets that are available in a game, and then you start to create market mechanisms around these assets, you get players participating in it, you actually get players who are able to potentially earn an income from the games that they love. And that's just going to get players more and more invested in games. And as developers start to, in the games that they already love and play, and then as developers start to get, realize new revenue streams and business models from enabling that type of economy in their games, they'll start to innovate more and more. And that's where, we're again helping developers embrace some of these building blocks that could enable things like DAOs for players to, vote on content, or on, potentially control the rules of the gaming system, and, the characteristics of items in the games. It could enable things like services inside a game. So it's not just about, goods and transactions, but, what if I, as a player, I love a game and I love to play with my friends, but I just don't have a lot of time. And there might be some task that needs to be done in the game that I don't have time to fulfill myself, but could I pay another player to do it, on my behalf, without having to give over my account credentials or go to some, third-party website? Could I just do a marketplace transaction for those types of services? I think as these smart contract governed, trust minimized marketplace systems come to the fore, developers embrace them more, players embrace them more, we'll see all kinds of creative innovations in the space that will really make games like more compelling for players, more beneficial for developers and content creators, and ultimately we think just make the space even bigger, and of course drive a lot of adoption of blockchain itself.
Yeah, we're very thrilled to have you at the Ethereal Summit, and seeing that you're getting more and more involved with the Ethereum ecosystem. I know that we've been having a lot of conversations between ConsenSys and Forte as well over a variety of subjects, such as identity, education, tokenization of digital assets. What do you see going forward Forte's role in the Ethereum ecosystem?
Yeah, so our main thing, again, is we want to help drive adoption of this stuff through game developers and game players. We want to, hopefully we create these systems, these marketplace mechanisms that are useful in games, and they're open so anyone can use them. Hopefully they have applications, beyond games as well, for other types of applications, or in DeFi in general. That's part of what we're excited about, working with ConsenSys and others in the space on. As you mentioned, Pei, I think, identity is a really important aspect of, if you're really going to have these community economies, these trust minimized marketplaces, how can you do that if you don't have decentralized identity in some form, so that players really are self-sovereign about, their accounts over time, and especially things like, for larger companies that start to adopt blockchain and worry about compliance and know your customer rules, can players ultimately be self-sovereign with those sorts of things? That's where we're excited about the Decentralized Identity Foundation and some of the work going on there. I think there's a bunch of these fundamental things, we want to work on in general that will benefit games, but extend far beyond games as well. Some of that's about education of what's possible with these marketplace economies. Some of that's training for developers. Some of that's content publishing so that players, developers, and others start to learn this stuff. And some of it's, working on things like decentralized identity or token taxonomies, like ConsenSys has with the Token Taxonomy Initiative, to really help bring this stuff forward and help more developers understand it and therefore adopt it.
Sounds great. I think the last question, since we're still waiting for some questions to come in, are there any, for the gamers on this call, are there any special challenges for realizing this vision in-game marketplaces? And are there any kinds of innovations do you see that Forte or the blockchain gaming ecosystem in general can develop to solve them in the coming years?
Yeah, there's a couple of challenges. One is, as we discussed, games have so many different kinds of assets in their economies today, and potentially even more goods and services and types of assets in market-based economies in the future. That providing a market mechanics and liquidity and price discovery for all that wide variety of assets and services and goods is difficult. That's again where fundamental building blocks like an automated market maker that can scale to support games with millions or tens of millions or hundreds of millions of users are really important. But there's challenges beyond that too. There's a lot of education to do with game developers. There's education to do with players, to really get them to understand how these systems work over time, and the fact that they really do have ownership and agency in games in a way that they really have never had before. There are games today that introduce market economies or some semblance of it, marketplaces into their games, and that's part of what gives us confidence that the industry is ready for changes like this. Is some games that introduce marketplace economies like Roblox, have just grown a ton the last few years. Or if you look at Counter-Strike Go, it's a popular esports game, an online shooter. It has a thriving skins marketplace that does an order of magnitude more revenue than the core game itself. So there are some of these fundamental systems in place in games today, but players ultimately feel they have to rely on a sole developer that charges potentially large fees, or a sole distribution platform that can ultimately affect a market. And the biggest set of innovations really to come will be around how do we fully decentralize these systems over time? How do we give players more ownership? How can we create community governance rules? How do we do things like decentralized identity? You have to start with solving the marketplace problems and get players interested and get developers educated on it, but then there's a whole next set of challenges beyond that to really make the market as credible as possible and decentralize it more and more and more.
Excellent. This has been a really fun discussion, and I truly enjoyed it. I checked really quick, and seems like there are no Q&As at this point. But so thanks again, Josh, for being with us today. I've personally learned so much about gaming and blockchain and gaming, and I look forward to hearing more exciting news coming out of Forte. And thanks all for those who joined us today.
Yeah, thank you, Pei. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in, and we'll hope to be talking more soon. Thank you so much.